Hello, my name is Bruna Leo, and today I'm going to be talking about my Unit 2 exam, application exam, and I'm going to have a part 1 and a part 2. So for the part 1, as chapter 8 and 9 of our performance of literature textbook describes, a poem has both an expressive and unified kind of language. Expressive language is described as one that moves past literal meaning and gives more emphasis on the connotations than the definitions, using many forms of figurative language to avoid many cliches. For a poem to be unified, it needs to show that it is whole, meaning that when reading a poem, no parts seem to stick out as if it's a part of another poem. My poem is I Said to Poetry by Alice Walker, and it is a poem that is very expressive and unified because of the language chosen. Not only describes a conversation throughout its entirety, but it also describes the unpredictability of the creative process. It never fails to stay in format, always seeming to be in a conversation. It also uses many forms of figurative language, though the most obvious one is personification, because throughout the entire poem, the persona has a conversation with what they say is poetry, but I'm pretty sure it's just their part of their head that is their imagination or their inspiration, so to say. They have, but not only do they talk with poetry, but poetry does all other kinds of things that poetry should not do because it doesn't exist. It does being personification. It does things such as lay dead. Outside of that, another major figure of speech it shows is imagery, which one of the biggest examples of is whenever poetry describes the desert or the canyon, whenever trying to convince the persona to get out of bed and and write some poetry because the persona is tired. Though at the beginning of the poem, we also see a slight bit of hyperbole when the persona says that describes that this says having to almost die, because in the context of the poem, they're basically saying that they almost have to die to get inspiration, or the feeling that they're almost dying from lack of inspiration, you could say. And that is a very big exaggeration because they will not almost die from not having inspiration. Though another thing that is to note is that the the poem is through another thing to note is that throughout the poem it is in first person perspective. Because no matter if they're having a conversation, the author is just talking about herself, and the one who's responding it is also herself. It's her idea of inspiration or poetry. For the second part of the Unit 2 exam, I will be talking about Alice Walker, the author of I Said to Poetry, which was released in 2007, the same year that Harry Potter had just sold more than $1 billion in publishing. NASA had also sent a spacecraft that eventually found evidence that there used to be water on Mars. In 2007, also, Steve Jobs had unveiled the first iPhone. Harry Potter is a phenomenon that was created in 1998 by J.K. Rowling. Not only did it create a new craze for teen fantasy books, but the movies that were released starting 2001 also signified that they were able to reach a bigger audience. the fact that the fact that it sold more than $1 billion in publishing alone shows that it had become an icon of pop culture. NASA, which had become really famous at that point because of the moon landing, was still struggling at that time with technology because the technology needed to send to Mars, which was the next nearest body in space. It was previously impossible to send anything to Mars because of the sheer distance, but in 2007, the technology that had finally advanced enough to allow a spacecraft to reach Mars and get some samples, which proved that there used to be water in Mars. On the other hand, now renowned pioneer of the computer era, Steve Jobs had just released the first ever iPhone in 2007. This was a big deal and pioneered not only phones but computers, because it really sped up the process for how technology was made. The iPhone was a revolutionary piece of technology that not only introduced touchscreens, but that there could be a camera and a web browsing abilities in a tiny item that could fit in somebody's pocket. In conclusion, 2007 not only showed the culmination of Harry Potter as an icon of pop culture, but it also showed a great advancement of science for NASA and the beginnings of one of the greatest tech icons known nowadays.